Hello everyone, today I'll be getting into the CyberArk Privilege Cloud ISPSS architecture. My name is Brad McDowell and I'm a Senior Privilege Cloud Consultant here in Australia. So the objectives for today is we're going to go through a high-level deployment overview and what that might look like. And then after that, we'll go through the low-level architecture components. There are a couple of acronyms I'd like to remind everybody about. So PSM means the Privilege Session Manager. This is the component that does the session isolation and recording. The CPM is a CyberArk Policy Manager. This is a component that actually does the password rotations, verifications, and reconciliations. And then finally here we have the new CyberArk component of SIA, or Secure Infrastructure Access. So first we'll go through a high-level deployment of CyberArk Privilege Cloud. A typical deployment will have a minimum of 2 data centers or 2 sites. It doesn't really matter what they are as long as they're geographically separated. And for the purposes of this diagram, we've got the CyberArk Privilege Cloud represented down here, and I'll go in more details into that in the next diagram. A typical deployment will have a minimum of 2 Windows connector servers. You could have more than 1 Windows connector server in each site. It doesn't really matter as long as you've got that high availability when it comes to the Windows services that are represented here. I'll go into more details of what these Windows services are that support connecting the environment to CyberArk Privilege Cloud. Optionally, you can also deploy the Unix connector. All the connector servers that you deploy will communicate outbound to the CyberArk Privilege Cloud. And the lines that we've drawn here are represented by these protocols down here. So green means the HTTPS traffic, and the orange lines here means the CyberArk Vault protocol that runs on port 1858. If you're deploying the PSM service and PSM for SSH service, you'll need a load balancer. Doesn't really matter what type of load balancer it is, as long as it can do a TCP load balancing capability, and it can also do a health check capability. It's important that when the load balancer decides to send traffic to a server, that the server is healthy, of course. And over here we've got the end user. The end user will connect to the CyberArk Privilege Cloud using their web browser, and they possibly also will be using other utilities such as an SSH client or a database client. They'll also make connections to the CyberArk Privilege Cloud when using the SIA service. I'll cover more on the SIA service in the next diagram. But for now, I'll go back to the traditional PSM and PSM for SSH sessions. So if a user wants to connect to a target, they can web browse into the platform, click connect on their desired target. That will download an RDP file to the end user. The end user will open that RDP file up. The RDP file will be pointing at the load balancer. The load balancer will then decide which Windows PSM server the connection will go to. You can decide on how this happens. It could be least connection, round robin, whatever you decide to configure in your load balancer. And of course, once the connection gets to the Windows PSM service, the PSM server will then know which target you're trying to connect to, so it will go and grab the credentials from the CyberArk Privilege Cloud over the CyberArk Vault protocol on port 1858. Once it's got the credentials, it will then establish a connection to whatever target system you're trying to access. So next I'll talk about the PSM for SSH. So this is where an end user can use their favorite SSH client and connect to a target. I've put an example PSM for SSH connection string here on the screen. They'll put that into their favorite SSH client, and the SSH client will connect to the load balancer. The load balancer will then decide which PSM for SSH server that will connect to. Of course, this is all running over port 22 as represented down here. And so now I'll clear the screen and we'll cover how all the components interact with each other and communicate. So as I go through this diagram, everything on the left-hand side of the screen here is represented by the customer environment, and everything on the right-hand side is all the components hosted by CyberArk in AWS. So a typical customer environment will have an Active Directory and many different types of target systems and applications. And on the right-hand side of the screen here, I'll go through all the different CyberArk services that come with the CyberArk Privilege Cloud ISPSS platform. So we'll start off with the identity administration. This is a portal where you log in and configure all the policies and access controls to the platform. The identity user portal is where the end user can access their WPM passwords or any applications you've presented to the end user. And down in the bottom left here, we've got the CyberArk Vault, and this is where all the privileged vaulted credentials are stored, as well as all the PSM recordings and account information. And we've got the Privilege Cloud portal here. This is where the users can interact with their vaulted credentials stored in the vault. Next, we have the Secure Infrastructure Access. This is the web portal where the users can make connections to their targets, as well as administrators can configure their SIA service on what access controls are available to the end users for their target SIA use cases. Next, we have the Connector Management Portal. What this service does is helps manage the lifecycle of the Windows Connector server I'll go through in a moment, as well as the Discovery service, which I'll explain later. Next, we have the Remote Access Portal. This serves as two main functions. The first function is the offline access capability. So if you want to store passwords offline on mobile devices, if in the event there's a problem with Privilege Cloud, you can retrieve passwords if you've configured that. The second component to the Remote Access Portal is allowing the vendor access capability. If you've purchased licenses for that, the vendors can access the environment using the security controls offered by Remote Access. We also have the Discovery service. So the Discovery service is an engine that will scan the environment through the connector management connectors. We have the HTML5 gateway service here. This allows end users to connect to targets using a web browser. I'll explain more on that later. And finally here, we've got the audit service. The audit service is a way that you can view the logs within CyberArk, but I'll show you later on how you can get the logs out of audit and into your SIEM platform. And there are a number of security and infrastructure items backed in AWS for the environment. So a customer doesn't need to worry about the storage that is consumed by CyberArk Privilege Cloud. That's all managed by CyberArk. Each customer has their own dedicated vault server and database for their tenant. And of course, all the services that are included in the ISPSS platform is all managed and monitored by CyberArk. And if any email notifications are generated in the CyberArk Vault, for example, they're sent by the Amazon SES service. And finally here, all the web portals that are presented in the ISPSS platform, they are protected by the AWS CloudFront service. So next, I'll talk about how we get the end users and groups into this CyberArk identity platform. There are many ways you could manage this. You could stick with just cloud users, but most environments will have some sort of existing identity platform that is a source of truth. So one way we can achieve this is get the users from the external IDP. With your external IDP, you can configure a SCIM integration in the Entra, for example here, and send the users and groups to identity using the SCIM protocol. So that's one option. I'll just clear this away. The other option is where you might want to gather your on-premise Active Directory users and groups and send them to the identity platform. So to achieve this, you'll need to install the identity connector on a Windows connector server. It actually can be any member server, but typically it's installed on the CyberArk Windows Connector server. And that's represented by this icon here. So what this is effectively is an AD proxy. It will make a connection to the CyberArk Privilege Cloud over port 443, and then it will communicate with your Active Directory on port 636. So the end outcome is identity can query your Active Directory and gather all the users and groups. It's not a synchronization per se, it's allowing the CyberArk platform to query your Active Directory. You can also use a combination of this and an external IDP. For example, Entra we had in the previous little diagram here. You could have Active Directory as your source of truth for the users, but when they authenticate, we could use an external IDP such as Entra and do SAML authentication to the portal for the end users so they can have their traditional MFA capabilities that are offered by Entra if you're wanting that. If you don't want to use that, you can use the MFA capabilities in the identity platform. So now I'll dive deeper into the Windows Connector services. So the next service that we'll talk about is the Connector Management Agent. This will be installed on the Windows Connector server, and it initiates an outbound connection to the Connector Management portal. The Connector Management Agent does two things. It will allow the Discovery service to communicate into the environment and do its relevant scans, as well as it manages the lifecycle of the CPM and PSM services. So when they're installed by the Connector Management Agent, these services will communicate to Privilege Cloud over the relevant protocols that are required. So they are at a high level, the port 443 and the port 1858. The next service here is the Windows SIA connector. This service communicates outbound on port 443 to the backend CyberArk Secure Infrastructure Access service. Next, I'll talk about the Linux connector server. There are two services that you can install on this. One is the SIA service. Just like the Windows SIA service, it will communicate to the SIA backend service if you're deploying that. And the second service you could install is a traditional PSM for SSH service. Again, this will communicate to the relevant protocols, including the Privilege Cloud API, as well as the CyberArk Vault on port 1858. It's important to allow both the Windows Connector server and the Linux Connector server to communicate outbound on port 80 to the OSCP responders for the relevant certificate authorities. So I'll go back and talk about the Discovery service. The Discovery service is where you can configure the ISPSS platform to scan for privileged accounts in your environment. The way that it achieves this is once the Connector Management Agent has established a connection to the CyberArk Privilege Cloud, the Discovery Agent will make connections through this service, and then once it gets the Windows Connector server, it can then head off to the targets and log into those targets and scan for privileged accounts. So next I'll talk about the audit information. So there's two ways we can achieve this. By default, the Vault logs are sent to the audit service. Among other service logs are sent to the audit service. And this is where you could see all the events that are happening in the CyberArk Privilege Cloud. Now, most environments will have an external SIEM. Check the documentation on which providers are supported. But basically, there are two ways you can achieve this. The most modern way of getting the audit logs from CyberArk to your SIEM platform is using the API. So your SIEM platform will make a connection to the audit service and retrieve the audit logs and back to your SIEM solution. A traditional method of how you could get Vault logs from the platform to your SIEM solution is using the Secure Tunnel service. So the Secure Tunnel service is represented by this icon here. It's a Secure Tunnel backend. And we also need to install a Secure Tunnel client on the Windows Connector server. The Secure Tunnel client, what it does, it establishes a connection outbound to the Secure Tunnel backend, just like all the other services here. And then from here, the Vault server will be able to send a syslog through the Secure Tunnel backend, through the Secure Tunnel client, and onto your SIEM collector and forwarder. This is typically done over TCP 514. You can encrypt this traffic by using TLS logging, and you can decide which port you want to use. And just a note here, UDP logging is not supported, so it has to be a TCP or TLS communication. And of course, this is encapsulated in the secure channel traffic when it goes over the internet. So that of course is encrypted there also. So now we'll go through some scenarios and how an end user will make connections to the platform. So the end user will mostly open their web browser and connect to all the relevant portals. And like in the last diagram, they might use a SSH client or database client or RDP client to connect to the SIA service when connecting to their infrastructure. So let's talk about that. So a user could be using an SSH client or the RDP client. They can also connect to the Secure Infrastructure Access portal. That'll help the end user on how they can create a connection string or download an RDP file to use the SIA service. It's also where they can get their temporary password for database connections, for example. So once they've got the information they need for their target system, they'll use the relevant client and connect to the SIA service. The SIA service will then make connection through the SIA connection and then head off to the target system. So if this was an RDP session, the session is recorded here. If it was an SSH session, all the logs, event logs will be recorded in the SIA service. Next, I'll talk about the traditional PSM and PSMP like I talked about earlier. I just want to cover that in a bit more detail than what we did in the earlier diagram. So of course, you'll need a load balancer. So in the journey of making a PSM connection, the end user may log into the Privilege Cloud portal and download the RDP file for the PSM session. They'll open up the RDP file. That will connect to the PSM load balancer on port 3389. So this will be done internal to the environment. The load balancer will then decide which Windows connector server will connect to. And in this case, there's only one drawn in this diagram for the purposes of representation. The PSM service will then go and collect the credentials from the vault of the target system that we're trying to connect to. And then the PSM service will head off and connect to the target application on the relevant protocol. In this example, we'll say it was a Windows RDP session. And of course, we can talk about the PSM for SSH. So an end user will use their connection string. So there's an example there. They'll use that connection string and they'll connect to the load balancer. The load balancer will then make a connection to the PSM for SSH server on port 22. The PSM for SSH server will collect the credentials for the target server we're trying to connect to from the Vault server on port 1858. Then the PSM for SSH server will make a connection to the target server in this example. Effectively, the PSM for SSH becomes like a SSH proxy. Next, I'll talk about the HTML5 gateway. So let's say the user is outside the environment or wants to make connections to their target systems within their web browser. They can do that. So they simply web browse to the CyberArk Privilege Cloud portal. They'll click on the target they want to connect to. That will open up a new web browser tab where the HTML5 gateway will make a connection through the SIA service. And then once it gets to the SIA connector, it will then make their connection to the load balancer in this example. And then the load balancer will then, of course, make a decision on which PSM server to go to. In this case, it could be the same server than what the connection came from. And then the PSM server will repeat the example earlier of collecting the credentials from the Vault server and connecting to the end target. It's also worth noting, if we go back to the SIA service here, the SIA service, we can use both a Windows connector server and the Linux connector server. So it is possible to connect to a Windows target or a database target using the Linux SIA connector server. So that's drawn by this line here to represent that workflow. So this completes all the items that you might use to interact with the ISPSS platform. So in this example I've got here, we're using Active Directory as our source of truth. And we've got drawn here the secure tunnel method of getting the logs to your SIEM solution. I'm just going to clear this away. So I've gotten rid of the secure tunnel here, and I'm representing how if you're using an external IDP platform, in this example it's Entra. So Entra, you can get the users into identity using the SCIM protocol, and then the end user can use the SAML authentication to authenticate with Entra, and this in turn will allow them to access the relevant Privilege Cloud portals. I'll leave links in the video description of where you can access these diagrams, but for now I'll finish the video here. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.